Happy New Year, Holy Posters. This is Skye, and before we get into the show, I have an important announcement. Later this month, we're going to experiment with a different format. Instead of one Holy Post episode per week, we're going to release 2 episodes each week by splitting the news segment and the guest interview into 2 shows. So instead of one long 90-minute show, you'll be getting 2 more accessibly sized Holy Post episodes every week. Like I said, this is just an experiment that will begin later in January, and we welcome your feedback. Do you love it? Do you hate it? And it's just the beginning of all kinds of new things we'll be trying in 2023. So stay tuned. It's going to be an exciting year for the entire Holy Post community. Thank you for being a part of it. Okay, on today's show, new research shows married mothers are happier than single mothers or women without children. Is it proof that the conservative view of family is best? Then, a survey of Democrats and Republicans reveals that both sides now believe members of the other party are simply the worst. Is there any hope for healing the divide? Then, what makes human leg muscles different from other primate species? Phil gets to the bottom of it. And I interview Walter Kim, the president of the National Association of Evangelicals, about the future of the evangelical movement in America. You do not want to miss this conversation, I promise. All of that, plus drunk Santas crash a tank, and hormonal Rwandan elephants. Here is episode 542.
Hey there, this is Phil. Welcome back to the Holy Post podcast. I'm here with Kaitlyn Shess. Hi, Kaitlyn.
Hi, Phil.
And Skye Jitani. Hi, Skye.
Hello.
Hello. It is Monday, the 2nd of January, 2023, as we record this.
Are we supposed to be excited about that?
We've never recorded a podcast in 2023.
Okay.
Wow.
I think New Year's is kind of dumb.
Kaitlyn, you're back. You had a big trip.
I did.
Tell everybody where you went.
I went to Rwanda to visit my family for Christmas. And I had a lot of people, after Skye and I mentioned it a few weeks ago, message me and ask like what mission organization I was going with or what special service trip I was doing. And
yeah,
I was just visiting my family and having fun.
You have Rwandan family?
Yes, my aunt and uncle live there.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I love how when somebody travels to Africa, the assumption is it must be on a missions trip. Because why else would you go?
No one asked me when I went to Italy if I was going on a mission trip, but everyone asked me if I was going for Rwanda. And actually, we went to a game park and saw a bunch of really cool animals and stayed at a resort there that's like the nicest resort I've ever stayed at in my life. So I did the opposite of a mission trip at Rwanda.
The irony is I think there's a higher percentage of Christians in Rwanda than there are in Italy.
There's a pretty high percentage of Christians in Rwanda, which is amazing because we also went to the Genocide Museum there. And it's one of the places that I think earliest in the aftermath of a really horrible event did people really reckon with the fact that it was really the fault of colonists who had kind of created racial differences in Rwanda and stoked conflict. And the church was very involved in that. So the fact that there is such a high percentage of Christians in that country after the church perpetuated such injustice is really incredible. And they do not need me probably to go be a missionary there.
Do contemporary Christians see it that way? Is that the way they identify the role of the church historically?
I do think probably because this is a more recent event, it's meant that pretty quickly people recognize that. And it was just so clear cut. Like there's lots of other, African countries where a lot of their poverty and injustice you can trace to the injustice of colonialism in their country. With Rwanda, it's so explicit. It's like there really were colonists that came in and said, no, these divisions that you have created that are really fluid and have more to do with kind of wealth and status in the community, we're going to turn those into racial categories and we're really going to pit you against each other. And then when we pull out and then the genocide happens, we're not going to take any responsibility or be involved in any way. We're going to pull out some Western people. We're going to put money towards that, but not really put money towards stopping the genocide. So.
Well, that's chipper. Merry Christmas, everybody.
Happy New Year.
It is an important thing to learn about. I would really recommend people doing some research into the history of Rwanda, and including all of the really beautiful and wonderful things that are there apart from the genocide.
Speaking of, I wasn't on social media much over the holiday break, but I saw 2 posts from you, Kaitlyn. One had a baby elephant and the other had some very old books. And I thought,
yes,
what better summary of Kaitlyn's holiday than baby animals and books?
Okay, but here's the thing that I learned. One day we saw baby elephants because elephants are matriarchal. And so the mom elephants and the baby elephants live together. And then the, male elephants just go off and do their own thing. And this is wild to me. We saw baby elephant, mommy elephant. They were, a little territorial about the babies, but they were mostly good. Next day, we saw a male elephant. And male elephants, I'm not making this up, you can Google it, have a hormonal cycle. And every once in a while, they're in this certain period where they're incredibly aggressive in irrational ways. Like you don't even have to really do anything and they will get you. And we got stuck in this road for a couple of hours waiting for this very angry elephant. We had nowhere else we could go. And he was very upset. We saw people almost get trampled because they stupidly got out of their cars when they saw the elephant so close. Elephants are very cute. Baby elephants are very cute. Hormonal male elephants, very
Not
dangerous,
cute.
could kill you. Yeah.
Not cute. Wow,
Not cute.
That's a valuable lesson, which reminds me of something equally important, that in all of this talk about elephants and Rwanda, we forgot to play the theme song. And now the theme song.
What's the news that you like the most? Who's your favorite podcast host? If it's breakfast, get your toast. It's Skye and Phil and the Holy Post. Skye and Phil and the Holy Post.
And sometimes Kaitlyn.
Okay, the holidays are over, but the cleanup still remains. I think you can, I'm sure you're still cleaning up, Kaitlyn and
It is
Skye.
still Christmas, Phil.
Your household. Oh, don't give me the actual theological.
I'm just saying, it's still Christmas.
Okay, it's still Christmas. Okay, but we're cleaning up from New Year's. We're cleaning up from Christmas Day, wrapping paper, cleaning up. Or if you're in Cornwall, England, you might be cleaning up an armored personnel carrier that's stuck in a hedge that was put there by a group of drunken Santa Clauses. Might be something that would be happening. Pub crawling Santas get armored vehicle stuck in Cornish hedge. A vintage armored vehicle filled with Santas had to be freed by police after getting stuck in a Cornish lane. The Santas, who were believed to be on a pub crawl, got wedged in a hedge at Marsh Lane near Hale.
How did the hedge stop it?
They had an antique, that's a good question. It was a very narrow lane. It was an antique tank. Most of the spectators called it a tank. Technically, it was an armored personnel carrier. But it was trying to go down the main entrance to this little town, which goes in between a building and a hedge, apparently. And it's apparently an ancient, very old, thick hedge. And it got stuck. The tank full of Santas was also spotted earlier in the day in other towns along the west coast of Cornwall. Lisa Chard, who filmed the group in one town, said, "There was a group of Santas in the tank, and they were all very friendly and full of Christmas joy."
Okay. This does seem like a very English kind of story.
Yeah.
Where
A tank full of Santas stuck in a Cornish hedge?
Yes, because going back to the tank and the hedge thing, like it seems like something the English would do to say, if you're going to invade our country with a tank, we're going to build hedges. Hedges are what's going to stop
A
it. Darn
hedge
it.
of protection
But it
Right.
did.
around
go.
your Cornish village.
And then the idea of intoxicated Santas is very Dickens-ish, right? Because that was the reputation. We talked about this on our Santa Claus episode. The reputation of Christmas prior to the 20th century and late 18th century, 19th century was that it was a debaucherous kind of drunken festival.
Yes.
And Dickens comes along and Victorian England and all that tries to reform that. But that's very English to have drunk Santas.
Okay.
Does hedge mean something different in British English? It just seems like, how did the hedge stop it?
You haven't seen a good Cornish hedge.
Clearly.
And
yeah.
maybe the Santas driving the antique armored vehicle didn't really have the intention or the will to attempt to go straight through the hedge.
Yeah, that's probably.
And maybe there was a building on the other side of the hedge or someone's backyard. You're picturing in your head a small shrubbery in front of a field and saying, why didn't you just drive over the shrubbery?
That's 100%.
I have a feeling there was more involved than
okay.
that. Okay.
I want to see it.
Thank you. Okay, yeah, I didn't see a picture. Maybe there's a picture. You can Google Santa tank in Cornish hedge and see what comes up.
I'm working on it.
Okay.
Okay, we haven't done something in a while, and since Kaitlyn is here and she's back from Rwanda and her mother loves animal news so much, it's time for News of the Butt.
Oh my gosh.
And now it's time for News of the Butt.
We've done News of the Butt for, 7, 8 years, a long time, a lot of butt news. And there's one question we've never answered as a News of the Butt story. Kaitlyn, you want to guess what that question is?
I absolutely do not. No.
Skye, you want to guess what that question is?
How many butts does it take to screw in a light bulb?
No. But that's a good guess.
Yeah,
the question
I thought so.
is, it's the central question of all butt-related questions. And since it's a new year, we need to start by asking the really big question. Why do we have butts? Why? Why do we have butts? That's the question that our friends at Gizmodo asked of 5 or 6 preeminent biologists, an evolutionary biologist. They say, okay, I know you're not quite following what I'm saying, but here's what I'm saying. What separates us from the animals? Is it the burden of consciousness, the terror of knowing that one day we will die along with everyone we've ever loved? Or is it our big, weird butts?
It's not.
I don't think that separates us from
No.
lots of animals. I mean, look at a baboon. They have
Yes.
a bigger, weirder butt.
Yes.
No, they don't. We're talking about the size of butt muscles, gluteus maximus. How big are they? Big, round butts. What species have big, round butts? Huh?
Sir Mix-a-Lotus, I believe,
You
is the
do not know what you're talking
species.
about. Okay. The first thing to understand is that humans are the only habitually bipedal primates. Gorillas and chimpanzees can walk bipedally for short periods of time. For kids at home, that means on 2 legs. But they're not doing it to the extent that humans are. Okay, here's Daniel Lieberman from the Department of Human Evolutionary Biology at Harvard. He says the big difference in the size of our butt muscles is running. The muscle making up the butt is the gluteus maximus. Yes, it's the largest in the human body, and its upper portion is vastly expanded in humans compared to apes. We barely use it when we walk. Now, did you know that? We barely use our butts when we walk. But when we run, it plays a key role in controlling the trunk, your torso, and extending your leg behind you, and slowing the leg when you're swinging it in front of you. So we could not run if we didn't have big butts, which is why most other animals, even those that can walk on 2 legs, when they need to go fast, they go down on all 4s because they can't do what we can do. They can't do, okay, here's Stephen Churchill, professor of evolutionary anthropology at Duke University. You can have lunch with him tomorrow to ask him if this is true, Kaitlyn. As our ancestors evolved to become proficient bipeds, that is, proficient at walking on 2 legs, the pelvis became shorter and wider so that the 2 small gluteal muscles, gluteus medius and gluteus minimus, we've always heard of gluteus maximus, right? But how could there be a maximus if there isn't a minimus? And the answer is yes, there is a minimus.
Aren't those constellations?
Gluteus medius, no Skye. And don't look at my butt that way. Gluteus medius and gluteus minimus migrated around the sides to help us stabilize the pelvis when we balance on 1 leg. That's a key to walking, is when you walk. Did you know this, Kaitlyn? When you walk, 75% of the time, you're on 1 foot. 75% of the time.
Didn't know that.
Walk. I think even more of the time when you're running. So the gluteus medius and the gluteus minimus migrated around the sides to help us stabilize the pelvis so we can better balance on 1 leg as we swing the other leg forward. In apes, these 2 minor butt muscles serve a propulsive role, but in us, they perform a balancing function. In turn, we have enlarged the gluteus maximus as a propulsive muscle that we use when running or when climbing hills or stairs. This is the last summary from Stephen Churchill, who you can have lunch with tomorrow in the cafeteria. These enlarged gluteus maximus muscles give humans our distinctive butt cheeks.
So what I'm getting from this is walking is not going to help tone my butt.
No.
But running or stair climbing will.
Yes, running and stairs. If you do Stairmaster, you get a burn, a gluteus maximus burn. Not from walking, though. Not from walking. And running a little bit. Yeah. But also think about this. I was thinking about this. Okay, Kaitlyn, you can say what
no.
you wanted to say because you're dying to say something.
No, this is not where I thought we were going. I thought that you were going to ask 5 kindergartners why we have butts or something. I didn't think it was going to be scientists.
Oh, no. Well, these were once kindergartners, but they're now biologists. So we just waited. We asked them when they were kindergartners, and
Got
they said,
educated.
Give me 25 years and a PhD, and I'll answer your question for you. Think about cows versus horses. Which one has big round butt? Cow.
Horse.
Yes. Think about zebras. That's the type of horse, right? How do zebras defend themselves against lions?
They run.
No, but if they actually get in a fight, what do? Do they try to bite them with their chompy teeth?
They kick.
No, they kick.
Like
That's
a donkey.
Right. What are you doing when you kick like a donkey or like a horse or like a zebra? You're throwing your leg out behind you. That needs a gluteus maximus. That's why horses have big round butts. Isn't that amazing? You didn't think about that, did you? Kangaroos don't have big round butts, and they kick, but they kick forward.
Yeah.
You don't need a big round butt to kick forward. You only need a big round butt to kick backward and to run and climb stairs. And now we know why we have butt cheeks.
You know what's interesting? Have you seen those humanoid-looking robots that are running and jumping and doing all kinds of stuff now?
Yeah.
They don't have like big butts.
Well, that's because the amount of power you get in the mechanisms that they use are not related to muscle mass.
I understand, but you would think there would be some anatomical equivalent, like you'd need a bigger
you need a
hydraulic
bigger
pump.
actuator,
Right.
but it's not like right behind you in a lump.
All right. Well, I'm not sure what I learned here.
I don't know either.
You learned why we have. But what do you mean? We answered an obvious question. It was a question.
Exactly.
Why do we have butts? And we learned
answered
the
an
answer. Don't
obvious-
tell me you didn't learn
Well,
anything.
no. The
Don't
real
tell me
question
that.
is, no, it's not why do we have butts. It's why do we have larger butts than other animal species. That's
true.
what you answered.
Yes.
I thought you were going down to like, why do we have a digestive tract that
that's
requires
true.
also what I
evacuation?
thought.
Ridiculous.
It's also what I thought.
That's not even a question. That's like, no, that's silly. Why does a digestive tract have to have 2 ends? If you
They
know
don't
the
all
answer
have
to
2
that
ends.
question,
They don't all have 2 ends, Phil.
They mostly have 2 ends, unless you have a transitory anus, which we're not
Exactly.
going to talk about again. Okay, This has been News of the Butt
This has been the news of the butt.
with that. But it was actually animal news. I'm going to change it to animal news so that Kaitlyn doesn't make those faces at me. Because
You
they
hate
make
him,
me-
I know.
They make me feel kind of bad about my choices in life. There's an article. Okay, sometimes we spend a lot of time, I think, saying, just because this is called conservative doesn't necessarily mean it's biblical or Christian. And we get criticized for that. Why aren't you criticizing the progressive things that aren't biblical? And it's because there's less association of progressive ideas with biblical ideas in our culture, specifically in our time. But sometimes the conservative idea is actually the better idea for human flourishing. And when that happens, you should be very happy to say, hey, look over here. And even the Atlantic is willing to say that in an article they published a few weeks ago under the heading, The Married Mom Advantage. Motherhood during the pandemic wasn't so miserable after all, but some moms did better than others. And what they're looking at is all the press that came out in the middle of the COVID pandemic that said it was the worst for mothers, for women with kids at home. Their lives became absolute hellish. And there were people wrote things like this: married heterosexual motherhood in America, especially in the past 2 years, is a game no one wins, wrote Amy Sheeran in a New York Times op-ed. In Forbes, someone wrote, moms are not okay. Pandemic triples anxiety and depression symptoms in new mothers. And Bloomberg, from a business angle, wrote, women who stay single and don't have kids are getting richer. So,
Well, duh.
okay.
That's like the biggest
News
duh.
to me.
I think that's true for men too.
Yeah, I think pretty much
Yeah.
anyone who doesn't have children gets richer.
Yeah. But
Financially, I should say.
Okay, so now here's where the Atlantic piece is going with this. Actually, no, it wasn't worse to be a mother during the pandemic. As tough as motherhood was during COVID, mothers were both happier and more financially secure than childless women during the pandemic. In 2020, 69% of mothers age 18 to 55 were completely or somewhat satisfied with their life, compared to only 61% of childless women, so about a 10-point difference. It's true that women saw their happiness dip from 2019 to 2020 as COVID set in, but the dip was actually more acute among childless women, according to the survey. And then if we go to finances, financially speaking, mothers ages 18 to 55 were also better off than childless women. The median family income for mothers with children under age 18 was $80,000 in 2021, but only $67,000 for childless women. These results are consistent with other research, for example, that shows that American parents report more income and daily joy than their childless peers, even though they also report more stress. Okay.
That sounds right.
Parents are more stressed, but they actually have more joy and more money. That's household income, I guess.
That's because you can send those children out to the factories to bring home the bacon.
That number was like 80,000 for a 2-parent family with a child under, at least one child under 18. 60-something thousand for a single woman. 60-something thousand for one person is very different than 80-something thousand for at least 3 people.
No.
Good point, Kaitlyn.
As Skye pointed out, it doesn't count the income that your young children bring in the coal mines and the textile mills.
The TikTok.
Here, mother. I made another farthing. The picture, though, becomes more complex when we consider socioeconomic status. And this is actually what I wanted to talk about. Poor mothers consistently report lower levels of satisfaction compared with wealthier mothers. Okay, that's probably not terribly revolutionary to consider. But even in the worst moments of the pandemic, more prosperous moms fared better than poor moms. One explanation that many articles have overlooked is that wealthier mothers were more likely to have a co-parent. And this is where it gets interesting. A staggering 95% of rich moms, upper income moms, had a husband or partner at home during the pandemic. For middle-class moms, it fell down to 81%, and for poor moms, it fell all the way down to 55%. So a 40-point gap in co-parenting between the wealthiest moms and the poorest moms.
Is there a chicken and egg thing going on here?
Yes.
Kaitlyn says yes right away. You know what I mean by that?
Yeah.
I know which comes first, the chicken or the egg? No one's ever been.
And I think you're probably true.
Mm-hmm.
What do you mean, Skye? Tell us what you mean so we can tell you we already agree with you.
Because if you are a single woman with a child, it's harder to support that child financially because you're essentially doing multiple jobs between caring for the kid and you're outside the home having to earn money to support the family, which puts stress on the whole system. And when you have 2 people who are trying to financially support a household, the burden is shared somewhat. So there's less stress. You're more likely to get ahead financially. You have more, to be crass, labor hours between the 2 of you to get ahead. And so a single parent is going to be less likely to escape the cycle of poverty than somebody who's partnered with somebody in a marriage who can work on it together.
But that's also a key question, because many people on the right will say, if you want to get out of poverty, get married, as if somehow walking down the aisle magically makes you jump into the middle class. Which,
well, we talked about this in the past. There's a lot of statistics that say if you want to get out of poverty, or if you at least want to advance economically and socially economically, do things in a certain order, meaning finish your education, get married, then have children. And if you do any of those 3 things out of that order, your likelihood of breaking out of your socioeconomic position becomes that much harder. So you could argue that's because it's the godly and upstanding and righteous way to do something, or you can argue it's the way our society has constructed itself so that those things in that order make for the easiest path.
And that it kind of ignores the ways in which poverty can increase the kinds of stressors that cause it to be more difficult to live a life in that kind of order, or to keep a marriage, or to... The one criticism I have, Phil, is that I don't think it's more conservative to say that people are happier in stable family homes. I don't even think it's conservative to say that children flourish best with two parents and I don't think any of that's conservative. It's just the degree to which we think certain policies should incentivize that or not. And if those policies actually incentivize that, if they help or harm the most vulnerable people, I think it's pretty hard. You'd have to go to the real fringes of the left to find people who would say that that's not true, that it isn't true, that there's like a real benefit to someone's flourishing to be in a stable family home.
I don't know. There are some people who will say we need to move away from a society that requires you to, get married and commit yourself to one person to be okay financially and try to build a society where that's not necessary. So there is that voice. I think the danger is you get into poor shaming, where if you just did things in the right order, and because you didn't do things in the right order, you have no one to blame but yourself, and I'm not going to help you because you didn't do things in the right order. And I do wonder, because it's like we've covered years ago Charles Murray's book, Falling Apart, which was a study of specifically focusing on the white working class and what's happened to the white working class since 1970. And this was, I think, also mentioned in this article. In 1970, there was no marriage gap between the upper class and the lower class, between the working poor and the wealthy. 0, 90+% married in all cases. So this has happened in the last 50 years, that the upper class marriage rates have stayed roughly identical over 50 years, and the middle class has fallen somewhat. Working class Americans have just fallen off a cliff. If you're a white woman who did not finish high school, your out of wedlock pregnancy rate is over 65%. So the vast majority of childbearing, if you don't have a high school diploma, is to single moms, even in the white community.
Yeah, am I mistaken? Or recently, for the first time, more than 50% of all children born in America were born to single women. Isn't that the case across the board?
I don't
know. I've never heard that.
I'm going to look that up.
Look that up. I'm going to say that's not right.
I think it is, but I'll look it up. But here's my point in raising it. Don't you think over the last, generation or multiple decades, as a culture, we have significantly destigmatized the shame of having a child outside of marriage?
Yes, which has also reduced the abortion rate.
Yeah.
Which has reduced the abortion rate, but it's also probably created greater economic hardship for these households of single parents, because I don't know if everyone is grasping the reality that having a child without a two-parent family is an enormous burden and a struggle for most households that don't make enough money. So we're kind of talking out of both sides of our mouths culturally, where on the one hand, we're saying, hey, there's no stigma in having a child outside of marriage. But on the flip side, we're then creating a situation where fewer and fewer people can get ahead economically. And then we're supposed to feel bad about that. So which is it? Or do we need to change the system entirely where having a child outside of marriage should have no economic impact, negative, for anybody?
Oh, now you're really getting down to the conservative versus the progressive argument, because the conservative argument says if there is a penalty for doing things in the wrong order, that helps people learn to do things in the right order. And on the progressive side, they say, but look at the victims. We need to help the victims and try to take away the penalty of one bad decision or one wrong turn, in changing, like incarceration. Whereas the right will say, hey, if you did the crime, you do the time. And the left will say, yes, but what caused him to be in a place where he did the crime? And if we could go back upstream and eliminate that, then maybe, we wouldn't have the problem. Help, Kaitlyn.
Help. I also think there's a problem where it's true on both the right and the left that we have such an individualistic way of thinking about everything. And so it really is inconsistent for people who want to say your choices about your sexuality, your choices about pregnancy, your choices about the kind of household that you live in are fully personal preference and just what you want. And then that ends up harming the people who end up as single parents, because a world of everyone having their own individual preferences and not feeling layers of obligation and mutual dependence with others means it's just up to you to take care of a child, where in the past, that hasn't always been true. I really don't want us to skip over the first part of the study that you were talking about, Phil, about childless women versus mothers during the pandemic, because I do think there's this narrative that says that as long as you're able to kind of mark your own path, go your own journey, climb whatever ladder, that like you should be able to create your own forms of happiness. And then women get saddled with the same burden that men have been saddled with in the past that says the best thing that you can do is kind of seek your own success as an individual. And that's not going to be satisfying. It's actually deeply human to be both needy and needed. And whether that's your biological children or not, you should exist in a community in which other people provide for you and you provide for other people. And I think the way that conservatives get this wrong is in just sort of saying, no, you should be penalized for not following this exact path. You should be penalized for not existing in this, kind of American dream white picket fence family. And the left gets it wrong by saying you can be happy living all by yourself and just making a lot of money and making whatever choices you want. And neither of those are true. I mentioned a few weeks ago the Andy Crouch book that Skye interviewed him on, The Life We're Looking For. And he talks about the difference between families, like nuclear families traditionally, and households, and how families traditionally lived in a larger web of a household where other people who were not biologically related to them were part of the ecosystem that took care of each other. And it's true that people need that if they end up in a situation where they're a single parent, but people need that if they're a childless person during the pandemic that's lived alone and all of a sudden you haven't seen or touched another human for 6 months. That's not a human way to live either. Even if the stresses of having a couple of toddlers is really significant, the stress of not having seen or touched another human being is really significant. So reclaiming that idea, even if it's not just within a nuclear family, but the idea that there is something you are missing as a human if other people are not dependent upon you and you are not dependent upon other people. And that kind of relationship is a really intimate one. It's not just one that you kind of walk into and choose by yourself.
Well, and that takes me back to the David Brooks piece that he wrote in the Atlantic, I think, on the decline of the nuclear family. And his point of view was that it was about time that the nuclear family declined because it was a post-World War II invention that worked for almost no one. Yep. And that's defining the nuclear family as a mom, dad, and kids that live in isolation from any other extended community. And his point was, in human history, it's never been possible for a mom, dad, and kids to live in complete isolation, or rarely possible unless you really, you were an amazing pioneer family that was just amazingly productive, or you were a wealthy family that could afford to employ all the assistance that you needed. But it's certainly not the model in the Bible. Nowhere in the Bible do you see a mom and a dad and 2.5 kids living in isolation. That unless they were hermits or nomads or something. So his contention was we have to get back to that idea of bigger support groups, which is at all ends of the economic scale. It's just at the upper end of the economic scale, you can pay to fill in, your kids need to learn how to play baseball. You hire a baseball tutor. Your kids need help with math. You hire a math tutor. So you just keep filling in with paid professional help. Whereas an uncle or an aunt or a cousin or a neighbor, would have done those things 60 or 70 years ago. Okay. Skye, you want to say something other than that you apologize for leaving us and then coming back?
Yes, I apologize for whatever's going on with my internet service today. As of 2020, the statistic is 40% of all children born in the United States are born to single mothers. And that has been rising pretty steadily. And there's actually, you can go state by state, and it's actually fascinating to see what states have the highest rates of single pregnancy or single mother births. And a good number of them are in the Bible Belt, which is fascinating.
And those in the Bible Belt, are they also the Deep South? Is there an overlay?
Yes, there is an overlay for sure, although not exclusively.
Hang on. So the summary statement from this Atlantic piece is, the roles of marital status and class have been strangely absent from our recent national conversation about motherhood. Maybe that's because many of the dominant voices in that conversation have their own ambivalent or even negative feelings about marriage. What they don't seem to appreciate is that their experiences are not representative of married motherhood in general, and that the hardship of navigating motherhood without a partner is especially great for poor mothers. If the data tells us anything, it's that that, at least for most American women, the pathway to happiness runs through married motherhood, not away from it. Now, that's something like if that came from the Family Research Council, you'd say, oh, those conservative Christians and always pushing on get married and have babies and all that. But it's coming from the Atlantic, and they're actual researchers with actual data behind it. Which brings me to the last thing I wanted to mention, because we trust or mistrust data based on where it comes from, because we have such deep animosity towards the other side in our culture. So some people will say, I'm not going to listen to that because it's coming from the Atlantic, except that it sounds conservative. So now we're confused. Do I listen to something that sounds conservative if it comes from a liberal source? Skye left us again. I assume he'll be dialing back in shortly. I'm just going to continue. This piece, data that David French put in a column over the weekend, what partisan Americans think of each other. Partisans hold deep animosity toward their party opponents. And then they ask the question, how much do each of the following phrases or words apply to Democrat or Republican voters? And they asked, the most interesting one is people who consider themselves devoted conservatives versus people who consider themselves progressive activists. So the most conservative or the most liberal. And then they say, do you agree with this term, that if you're a devoted conservative, Democrats are reasonable people? And the high agreement rate to that word reasonable was 2%. 2%! 2% of devoted conservatives believe that Democrats are reasonable people. So flip it. Okay, progressive activists. What percent of progressive activists believe that Republicans are reasonable people? 0%. It's actually less. 0% of Republicans we consider highly reasonable. Now, brainwashed, what about this term? If you're a devoted conservative, 90% of you believe that Democrats are brainwashed. If you are a devoted, 89 technically. If you're a devoted progressive, a progressive activist, 88% of you believe that Republicans are brainwashed. So it's this whole chart is almost exactly mirrored. So the words reasonable, are Republicans reasonable? Progressive activists, 0%. Honest, progressive activists, 1%. Caring, progressive activists, 2%. Believe Republicans are caring. Humble, progressive activists, 1% believe Republicans are caring. How many devoted conservatives believe Democrats are humble? 0%. 0% think they're humble. 1% believe Democrats are honest. 6% believe Democrats are caring. And now it gets...
But they mean that as an insult.
Now it gets weird. Don't do that, Skye. Now it gets even weirder. How about racist? If you're a progressive activist, what percent of Republicans do you think are racist? 84%. 84% of progressive activists think Republicans are racist. But now this is where it gets mind-blowing. If you're a dedicated conservative, what percentage of you think Democrats are racist? 76%. So almost identical. If you're a very conservative or very progressive, you believe there is racism in America, and it is the other side.
Okay, I have not read the article that this is attached to or the statistics. And so I'm in my element talking about something from a position of ignorance.
Yes, go for it.
Okay, so but I just want to speculate. I want to brainstorm here as to particularly why such a high percentage of Republicans would accuse Democrats of being racist.
I know exactly why.
You do?
Yeah, because I've been accused of being racist.
Yeah.
Multiple times.
On what front? Like, what's the...
Because I keep bringing up race. Because I see race everywhere.
So seeing race as being racist.
Yes.
Got it.
Or you're being...
I was thinking of two other things.
Or trying to keep... for example, trying to keep African Americans as loyal Democratic voters by promising them things and then not delivering.
Patronizing.
Right. That was one idea I've been hearing since the 1980s.
Yeah.
But the other thing that just in recent years I've been hearing much more of, and I think this is coming out of certain YouTube channels and rather deceptive voices, is this whole argument that it was a Democratic Party that supported the KKK. It was a Democratic Party that was the party of Jim Crow. It was Democrats in the South who instituted all these racist policies and segregation and on and on. And historically speaking, that's entirely true. But it's also historically nitpicking a little bit and deciding what pieces to ignore of history and how this is all transitioned. So, but that trope, that soundbite has been propagated so much in social media and Instagram and TikTok videos and stuff that I think people are actually believing that in a very limited view of history.
But Skye, that's not my point here.
Okay.
My point here is that every terrible thing that the other side thinks about you, you think about the other side. We have hit a parity of disdain for the other side, which means we also now have hit a parity of mistrust because the other side is not honest. Only 1% of devoted conservatives think Democrats are honest, and only 1% of progressive activists think Republicans are honest. So whatever information comes from the other side cannot be trusted. And that's what I'm trying to do here, is to say, no, we're not just backing up all of the conservative talking points that you would typically hear from white evangelicals like we are, except Skye, who's half a white evangelical and half an Indian evangelical, Swedish evangelical, I don't know, whatever you are. And we're not trying to sell everyone on a progressive agenda. What we're trying to say is let's look at the points from the right and left and then hold them up against what causes human flourishing as best we know and what is Christian as best we know, and then embrace the ideas based on that. And that we tend to talk more about ideas that are considered more liberal because our audience tends to mistrust those ideas more and we want to give them more of a hearing. That's what I wanted to say. Kaitlyn, tell me if I'm right or wrong, and then tell Skye if he's right or wrong.
I think you're right, I guess, and Skye is right. I do think those numbers are a helpful way to illustrate why it is so both satisfying and so simple to think about the other side, whatever that is, in those kinds of ways. Like, if they are all evil racists, I don't have to talk to them. I don't have to compromise with them. I don't have to admit they could know something I don't know. I don't have to be interested in them. I don't have to work with them. I can dismiss everything and not read their books or watch the news they watch or, even pay attention to them as people because they're just evil racists. It's a really easy tool to just have the world be less complicated. And it's simple in the sense that I don't have to think about what policies they support or what policies I support, or if maybe in this race I should vote differently than in this other race because this issue is important here and this person, I don't have to do, that is so much more difficult work than I'm on a good team, the other team is the bad guys, and it's just simple. And I can get it's really easy for people to take advantage of those kinds of feelings and to kind of push people in certain political directions if you can just pull on their kind of fear or desire and draw them in that direction. And so once the other side is coming for your children, you can be persuaded to vote in really simplistic ways, even if it's against your own interests, even if it's not going to actually serve you or your family. If you can feel like you're playing into the community and identity that they have constructed for you, then you can be persuaded to vote that way.
Can I add another application here?
Yes, Skye.
And that is, when I look at this chart, and maybe we can put this in the show notes.
We should.
For me, it's a really great visual reason why having Republican or Democrat as part of your primary identity, I think, is unfaithful as a Christian. I don't think it's wrong to be a Democrat or a Republican. I don't think it's wrong to vote Democrat or Republican as a Christian. But if it's part of your primary identity, the primary way in which you view yourself and the tribe to which you belong, it's just, you can't faithfully follow Christ and have one of those or the other be your primary identity, because it requires you to look so negatively upon your neighbor that it's just untrue. So don't misunderstand me. There are godly, faithful Democrats and Republicans out there. It's a question of primary identity. And gosh, these numbers are pretty scary. And it also makes me wonder, we've talked about this a number of times, sort of the big sort that's going on in our country where people are increasingly living in politically homogeneous communities and networks where Republicans don't personally know any Democrats and Democrats don't personally know any Republicans.
Right.
And if you don't personally know any of these people, it's much easier to believe 100% of them are evil, racist, brainwashed morons. So I know people from both parties. I love people in both parties. I have family members in both parties. And it's hard for me to say there are no honest, caring, humble, or reasonable Republicans. And same with the other side. So I think this chart partly reveals the fact that we're just living way too isolated. And the church used to be a place where these groups would intermingle and interact. But increasingly, that's not happening.
Right.
Well, and I don't think it's just, Skye, about how important that identity is to you. I really think it would be okay to say if it's an identity thing at all. Like, I've been reading this book by Ezra Klein, Why We're Polarized. And he has this great, it's like pulling from a bunch of different statistics and data, but he has this description of all of that data that says the more politically engaged you are, there's a significant kind of difference in how you vote. If you're less politically engaged, you're more likely to vote for policies that will benefit you personally. Like if you are afraid of an immigrant taking your job and that, that becomes like a really personal, I just lost my job and now I'm going to be really pulled into this narrative about why I've lost my job. Or if I have a lot of money and it's not actually enough for these tax cuts to matter to me, but I've listened to some media and those tax cuts matter, I'm more likely to vote. Even if I'm wrong about what benefits me, I'm still thinking in terms of what benefits me. The more politically engaged you are, the more you vote not on what benefits you, but on what your vote says about you as a person, what community it categorizes you in. So all of those words in the data that you just shared, words about who's caring and who's humble and who's racist, and you start voting based on not just, I'm a Republican, and it's an important part of my identity that I'm a Republican. You're saying my vote represents my character, my values, my family, my community. And suddenly you end up in a place where you're voting for lots of things that not only do not benefit you, people make bad decisions about what helps and hurts their communities all the time. You're not even paying attention to policies or what kinds of policies could benefit your community or not, whether you're right or wrong. Your vote is now this representation of your identity and your community. And that's like, you can't have a conversation around that. You can have a conversation around which policies actually benefit your community or not. Someone could teach you something about immigration that changes how you view immigrants and jobs in your community. No one can teach you something, new information, new data can't change the fact that your vote represents that you're a good, hardworking person, or that you're moral, or that you're trustworthy, or that you're not a racist. And that becomes an intractable conflict that you just can't get out of. Once it's an identity thing, it's so much harder.
Totally.
Amen. So for the next year and beyond, we are going to insist on not being conservative or progressive, not being Republican or Democrat. We're going to attempt to be Jesus followers, and we're going to attempt to look for policies that encourage human flourishing. And has been said that as angry as you get at someone from the other tribe, it's nowhere near as angry as you get towards someone from your own tribe if you feel they are betraying your tribe.
Which would explain a lot of the anger that gets thrown at us.
I think a lot of the animus that I get on Facebook or Twitter isn't necessarily about, oh, he's not in our tribe, but I thought he was in my tribe and he's not towing the party line. Mm-hmm. And so he must die. Okay, we gotta go. Welcome to 2023. We started out with some animal news, some butt news, some Santas stuck in a tank in a Cornish hedge. It's a pretty good start, I think, to a new year. Don't you think, Kaitlyn?
Great, fantastic.
Do you have a book coming out this year, Kaitlyn?
I do.
When's it come out?
August.
August. Ooh, we're going to count down the days. Every show we'll say how many days till Kaitlyn's new book.
Oh no,
every show.
Mine comes out in September.
What?
Well, that's later.
Yeah, then we can't. We'll start talking about that after Kaitlyn's comes out.
This is only my second, Skye. You've written so many.
Yeah, you're burping these out now. You're on.
Yeah, but mine has doodles. Does yours have doodles, Kaitlyn?
It absolutely does not.
When I'm done with it, it will. Okay. Thanks all for listening. Have a great beginning to your year. and hang around for the guest interview because it's a good one. Talk to you later. Bye. The Holy Post podcast is funded by listeners like you. This episode is also supported by Abide, the #1 Christian meditation app. Hey, this is Phil. My phone put the whole world in my hand, and that's not always a good thing. Have you discovered that doom scrolling your news feed isn't a great way to calm down before bed? How about turning to Scripture instead? The Abide meditation app is a wonderful way to slow down and de-stress before bed, first thing in the morning, or anytime life feels a little overwhelming. Download the Abide meditation app today and find peace amidst the chaos. Right now, we have a special offer when you subscribe. 25% off your first year when you sign up for the premium subscription, but only if you text our promo code HOLYPOST to 22433. So stop doom scrolling and let God's Word bring peace into your day and night. Download the Abide Meditation app and text our promo code HOLYPOST to 22433 today to get 25% off. This episode of The Holy Post is also sponsored by Faithful Counseling. My life has had more than a few ups and downs, and sitting down with a trained professional who shares my faith has been incredibly helpful. Fortunately for me, I live in Wheaton, Illinois, where if you throw a rock, you'll hit at least 2 Christian therapists. But what if faith-based counseling isn't available where you live? Now it is. Faithful Counseling is a Christian counseling service with more than 3,000 licensed therapists across all 50 states, with access by video or phone sessions, or even chat and text from wherever you live. With expertise in depression, stress, anxiety, trauma, family conflicts, and more. You can ask for a new counselor at any time, and financial aid is available for those who qualify. Maybe it's time to take advantage of a trained Christian professional counselor by visiting faithfulcounseling.com/holypost. They've even got a special offer for Holy Post listeners. Right now, you can get 10% off your first month at faithfulcounseling.com/holypost. And thanks again to Faithful Counseling for sponsoring this episode.
My father is a doctor, and one of the things he taught me was that if you don't get the right diagnosis, you will never get the right treatment. The way we diagnose a problem is going to determine what we believe the solution is. For 10 years on the Holy Post, we've been talking about the different problems facing American evangelicalism. And there's a lot of different ideas about what's wrong and therefore what's the right way to solve the problem. In fact, you could argue that's one of the key things that's dividing evangelicals right now. Some people believe that the solution is more cultural and political power, while others believe the answer is giving up on some of historic evangelicalism's beliefs. Others say we need to rethink the way we read the Bible, and others say we just need to get rid of megachurches. There's all kinds of different solutions out there. And that's why I was super grateful to sit down and talk with Walter Kim, the president of the National Association of Evangelicals, because I believe that his diagnosis of the problem was spot on, which gives me confidence that he's the right person to help lead us all into the future and into better solutions. Walter Kim became the president of the National Association of Evangelicals in January of 2020, just weeks before the pandemic broke out in the United States. So he's tackled a lot of challenges in his first 2 years in that post. Prior to that, he was a pastor at Boston's historic Park Street Church and also at Trinity Presbyterian Church in Charlottesville, Virginia. He has spent nearly 3 decades preaching, writing, and engaging in collaborative leadership, and he connects the Bible meaningfully to significant intellectual, cultural, and social issues of the day. As you hear more about his story and the diversity of his background and his embrace of the diversity of not just American but global evangelicalism, I think you'll understand where he gains the wisdom and insight to properly diagnose our problems and help lead us into the future. Here's my conversation with Walter Kim. Walter Kim, welcome to the Holy Post.
Skye, thank you for having me on.
I'm delighted that you're here. We've had some conversations apart from the podcast, and I've wanted to have you on for a while, so thank you so much for joining us. You became the president of the National Association of Evangelicals in 2020. Even without the political dynamics of that year, without the pandemic of that year, it's a pretty challenging time to step into a role in leadership of an institution that tries to engage evangelicals nationwide. When you accepted the role, what did you anticipate being the biggest challenges?
That's a great question. I certainly anticipated a set of challenges that were exacerbated by the pandemic. which, of course, who could have expected that? Going in, I knew that this would be a challenging leadership role because we live in challenging times. And even at my installation ceremony for the presidency, I was certainly giving congratulations, but I was also giving some condolences. Good luck in this really difficult moment. Political polarization, that's obvious. The increased secularization of our country and the ways in which religion is or is not permitted in the public square. Pluralization, in other words, the increasing diversity of our country, which is not only racial and ethnic, but it deals with ideological worldviews that exist in our country that did not exist beforehand. I mean, this is a very dynamic setting. And then certainly there are the challenges that exist within evangelicalism that were becoming increasingly clear in 2020, but had preceded 2020 by many, many years. And that is, what evangelicalism are we even talking about? Is it fair to even talk about evangelicalism or evangelicalisms?
And that was a topic I definitely wanted us to cover because going back to the very early episodes of the Holy Post back in the spring of 2012, we were talking even then about what is evangelicalism and is the word even useful anymore? And I was at a gathering some time ago where you shared some of your thoughts on that dynamic. And I would love to hear whether you still believe in retaining the evangelical label for reasons other than just the headache of trying to rebrand your own organization. But what are the challenges of that label right now, and why are you committed to retaining it?
Yeah. Let me begin with why I'm committed to retaining it, and then we can work our way into what are the challenges. There was a compelling experience that I had in 2019, shortly before I stepped into the role. I attended the World Evangelical Alliance gathering in Jakarta, Indonesia, where 90 countries were represented and is gathering about 800 evangelical leaders representing various national associations. And one of the panel discussions in the plenary session was about what's happening in American evangelicalism. There were representatives from South America, Europe, Asia, Africa. There was no American on the panel because they wanted a candid assessment of what was going on. I expected that conversation to be a litany of complaints and concerns. And there were certainly some critiques that were leveled in what was going on in American evangelicalism. But by and large, the panel was mainly a plea for a recovery of a robust evangelical faith and community in America, because that was important globally. There was a plea for partnership once again in the important work of the good news throughout the world and all the communities that were represented. And I walked away because I've been asked repeatedly, will you drop the term evangelical because it's so difficult and so contentious, and what does it even mean now? I walked away from that event thinking, no, I'm very committed to the term. Why would I leave my brothers and sisters in the global evangelical community, the hundreds of millions of evangelicals throughout the world, who are actually asking us to remain in partnership? And I thought it is a very American impulse to jettison something when it's inconvenient for us. So I think because of the breadth of evangelicalism and our place within it, that it seemed to me very important to maintain it. And then, of course, there's the long history of evangelicalism. And in the beautiful ways, of course, there are ugly, ugly moments, and I'm sure we'll have opportunity to talk about it, but beautiful ways in which it has represented a holistic approach of the gospel, represented in word and deed. And so for both the breadth of our commitments to the global community, as well as the depth of history, in terms of kind of faithful expressions of evangelicalism, winsome and winning expressions of evangelicalism. For those reasons, I think it was all the more compelling to seek for a robust recovery, reframing, reconstruction of what it means to be an evangelical.
So I appreciate that, because the global perspective does certainly change things. And yet I don't even know if you require a fully global perspective on it, even if we just have a diverse American perspective on it, looking at evangelical Asian Americans, African Americans, Latino Americans. There's a lot of health and vitality in the evangelical expression in the United States, including within white evangelicalism in some quarters. But getting back to the challenge we face here, and I appreciate your answer and I agree with it. Before taking this role, when you were a pastor, or even in this role, when you introduce yourself as an evangelical, or I'm the president of the National Association of Evangelicals, what barriers do you know are automatically going to go up in the imagination of the person or community you're talking to? What are those obstacles that word now automatically brings in our context that you know we have to deal with?
Yeah. I mean, we certainly have to deal with the ways in which evangelicalism is often viewed, portrayed, and sometimes actually really is, and so rightfully viewed this way as partisan in its politics, aligned in certain directions with a particular party, or contentious and narrow-minded in its approach to the plurality of our society, or its sexual ethics as being homophobic, deeply constrained and hypocritical in its uneven applications, and of course the abuse scandals that have arisen, on and on and on. There are certainly many issues with which this very term needs to be dealt with, and again, some of those are very legitimate critiques, and even those that are not or are caricatures of evangelicalism, which I would argue that is the case, as you've already alluded. Evangelicalism, actually Asian American evangelicalism, African American, so forth, very diverse and very different expressions of it. But nonetheless, the demand for a truer holiness, even when a critique is not appropriate or overblown, how could we not wish for a higher accountability in our representation of who Jesus is? So I hear those critiques, and they need to be dealt with because they bear directly on our ability to talk meaningfully about the Jesus we love and wish to portray to the world.
Yeah, there's been, you've seen much of it, the research that's come out from folks like Ryan Burge and others who look at the way that identity is popularly understood in the American pop culture. When the term evangelical comes up, it's immediately associated with a white conservative Republican. And it may or may not be linked to any kind of spiritual or religious theological identity at all. Toward restoring that, toward the pleas of that global evangelical community that you were talking about, that's saying to American evangelicals, please recover your identity and your spiritual vitality and your partnership. How do we do that? And what role do you see the NAE having in that work? Is it possible?
Yeah. Of course, I believe it's possible because I believe in a God who can raise someone from the dead and who has promised a resurrection of life for those who know him. And if a miracle of that order is possible, then the restoration of a faith community in a country is certainly possible. Will it happen? Well, that's another question. We've seen Christianity come and fade and go and move its locus from Europe to Africa and Asia now, in many, many ways, South America. So there is hope, there's aspiration, but there's also realism with the nature that God's work cannot always be predicted, and the faithfulness of his people is not always there. Having said that, I think there are a few ways in which the central problems strike me as dealing with an understanding of how the gospel relates to society at large. Very good. Evangelicals are universally very good about the individual implications of the gospel, personal salvation in Christ, but very mixed in its understanding of how to engage publicly. What are the civic responsibilities? What are the institutional, not just individual implications of the gospel? Does salvation have an impact on those things? There's a professor at the University of North Carolina, Molly Worthen, who has written a very interesting set of works talking about evangelicalism, not simply as a set of theological commitments to the high view of Scripture, to conversion to Christ, to the centrality of the cross, and to social activism. These kind of fourfold things that have often been called the Bebbington Quadrilateral because of the historian David Bebbington who came up with them. But she raised a very interesting set of points that it's not simply about these principles. There are a set of questions that evangelicals have grappled with. One is, what is the relationship between faith and secular knowledge? And we see those tensions. Evangelicals who are six-day young earth creationists, as well as evangelicals who hold to theistic evolution, and all the range in between. But another tension that evangelicals have not squared away is what are the implications, both personally and publicly, for our faith? It's not enough for evangelicalism simply to recover a deeper commitment to this Bebbington quadrilateral, to kind of the historic theological commitments. There is baked within the kind of popularism of American evangelicalism, the entrepreneurial spirit, the ways in which revivals broke out on the frontiers. There is this kind of impulse that is highly individualistic, very popularized, very diverse, grassroots, that makes answering the question, what are the personal and public implications of the gospel, exceedingly difficult. And it strikes me that we as evangelicals have not gotten that right. On the one hand, we can denounce racism and yet be silent in tacit support of systemic ways in which racism gets perpetuated. It's extraordinarily difficult. We can denounce racism in the 1930s and 40s. In fact, the NAE made a resolution in 1956 calling evangelicals to lead in what was then known as the human rights movement, equal dignity regardless of race. That was an official board resolution at the NAE in 1956. But in 1960, by and large, the NAE, and I will own this, did not show up for the civil rights movement in any consistent way. And I think that reflects the not only unease, but the uncertainty of how the personal and the public engagements of the gospel coordinate.
Okay, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there, both historically and in our current environment. So I don't even know where to begin to bite this elephant. But one of the things I've noticed from the NAE in recent years, and this goes back apparently all the way back to the 1950s, like in a number of areas, you've created resources, written papers, put out statements that I want to leap at and go, wow, that's fantastic. I mean, just going through the website, there's stuff about coronavirus, creation care, criminal justice reform, gun violence, immigration, refugees, religious liberty, LGBTQ citizens. I mean, all these highly controversial and divisive topics where really thoughtful evangelical leaders represented by the NAE are saying what I would consider to be very biblically faithful, deeply rooted in Christian thought perspectives. And yet, on a number of these things, when polled, popular evangelicals, the pew-sitting evangelicals, the ones who are, not necessarily engaged in academia and other more elite areas of thought, they tend to take stances that are very opposite to a lot of what NAE has put out there. It sounds like that's not new. That gap has always existed, perhaps, and not just unique to evangelicals, but a lot of different communities within the United States have a gap between their elites and the populace. But it feels like it's reaching a breaking point. And having been a pastor, you were a pastor for many decades, it's usually the pastor who stands in the gap between those two worlds, between the thought world, the theological world, the elite world, and the people in the pew. Is that where the breakdown is happening? Is that where the communication is not occurring back and forth? There's that old statement that if the people aren't following, you ain't leading. So if the people are not following what the National Association of Evangelicals is saying, are you really leading them? And where's the gap or the disconnect, do you think?
Yeah. Skye, thank you for asking that question. It's a very insightful question, very important question. It's the question of what will enable us to not only proclaim, but to form disciples for Jesus. I think it's a failure of the American church in its discipleship that would encompass the ways we engage society. The example I would use is when it comes to personal ethics, when it comes to our personal devotions, evangelicals, we know what to do. We have books to recommend, seminars that you can go to. It's not just about what is said in the pulpit, which is frankly very limited, right? I mean, just half hour once a week.
Or once a month.
Once a month, that's right. It's not just a communication issue. There's a fully developed formational approach with personal devotions, prayer life, retreats you can go to, lifelong mentoring program, all of that. Marriage, if there's a problem in your congregation with marriage, you have mentoring programs, 10-week classes, a retreat that you can send to, all sorts of issues. The average evangelical bookshelf would probably be filled with books on prayer or marriage or integrity at work. What we lack is the same kind of formation with our civic engagement. What do you do when a person is encountering a breakdown of public theology, public engagement? Your board of elders are divided over critical race theory. Your congregation is splitting over who voted for whom. And then you add the very contentious issues of human sexuality or any of the issues you just raised that the NE has spoken to. I think it's not enough to even just preach about it. It's not enough to write white papers or to have a website full of resources. What we really need to think about is the kind of formation we know how to do with personal issues like improving marriage or prayer life. We need to do with public discipleship. And the church in America is not there. We are not there. We don't have neither the imagination, the resources, the vision, much less the execution in any consistent way on these issues. Civic engagement then is reduced to tweeting, maybe a sermon for those who are bold of heart, but not a full-blown understanding of formation, discipleship.
So is part of the problem here, though, if I go back to my years as a pastor, if I got into the pulpit and preached a message about the importance of strengthening our marriages or the importance of being present as a father or mother in the lives of our children, like everyone's going to say, amen, that's wonderful. Thank you for the good biblical wisdom on these important areas of my life. But if I get into that same pulpit and say, we're having a breakdown in public safety in our community because of crime or guns or there are marginalized people in our community who are not receiving care because of their race or their sexual orientation. If I said any of those kinds of things, I'd immediately get branded as getting political. And then it conditions pastors to remain silent, and we essentially abandon those areas of formation and discipleship to other sources, to the media, most likely. Is that part of the problem, that we've just segregated out a huge category of areas of formation and say they're off limits because they're quote unquote political? And is there a way of bringing evangelicals back from that point of view to say, well, whether or not something's labeled as political is irrelevant. It's still under the sovereignty of Christ, and we need to be formed in that. Is that the problem, that we've just unilaterally kind of said all these areas are off limits because they've been deemed political by the culture?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. That we have conceded to politics what should have always been a part of the life in the kingdom of God. There was a reason why Jesus was crucified as King of the Jews by the Roman Empire, rejected by the Sadducees and Pharisees, brought before Herod the king, who distanced himself from Jesus, because the implications of his message were incredibly diverse and touched upon every aspect of life. And the early Christian, church was known as the church that would go to the trash heaps and recover abandoned Roman babies, girls in particular, who went back into the cities to nurse the sick when their pandemics swept through, who were known as people of tremendous hospitality. It wasn't just the fact that, look at those Christians, they must be worshiping a God that has something to say because they have good marriages. It's look at those Christians because of the ways they engage on the most dire issues confronting society, life. And I think it's a a truncated gospel, good news message that we have that has reduced the social implications of the gospel to a merely social application that you could take and make or not make, for that matter. I would wish to push us to say that it's not just a social application, like Jesus has changed your heart. Therefore, maybe you should volunteer at a soup kitchen or something as an expression of gratitude. That would be a social application of the gospel, and it's wonderful. Gratitude that leads to action like that is wonderful. But that makes it not necessary. It makes it just a wonderful application of the gospel, but not a necessary application of the gospel. I actually want to say that there are necessary implications of the gospel that are institutional. Now, by saying that, we have to differentiate between the principle, the policy, and the politics. And there is a possibility for the church to be robust in its preaching and formation of the principles, to engage with meaningful conversations about what policy implications would they have. But I do think that the church, should by and large stay out of the politics. By that, I mean endorsing candidates.
Right, the partisanship of it all.
Partisanship, right.
Yeah.
But we should be talking about immigration reform because we should be talking about the image of God. We should be talking about what does it mean that all of us are aliens and strangers in this world. We all are immigrants. Like that's by definition, to be a Christian is to be an immigrant in this world. Well, taking that theological principle, how does that apply to some of the ways we live out that in our policy commitments? That's going to be divergent. We get that. That's why we need that conversation. And much less, how do you end up voting or expressing that politically? That is even more divergent. But to avoid the theological and formational principles is to form disciples who are misshapen, to form disciples who are not fully engaged in the breadth of the good news in all aspects of life.
I appreciate that. And when it happens, it's such a wonderful experience. When you gather with Christian sisters and brothers, an example, we've had numerous conversations in recent months about abortion because it's been obviously a very big topic in the media since the Dobbs decision. And we've talked to various Christians who share the principle of cultivating a culture of life and recognizing the value of those preborn and throughout stages of life. But then there can be honest policy disagreements about what's the best way to do that. Yeah. Where does law come into play? Where does punitive action come into play? Where does cultural, all kinds of different policies, but we're all on the same page going after the same goal. How we get there, let's offer a lot of liberty and breadth, and we can learn from one another. And it also avoids some of the partisan dynamics. So when it functions, it's great. The hard part is there are some folks who don't want to have that conversation, or they've totally bought in all the way to the political and partisan line. I'm curious to know, when either as a pastor or now in your capacity as president of the NAE, when you get accused or your institution gets accused of you're getting political because you're raising certain topics or principles around those topics, how do you respond to that? One of the things I'm thinking of is there was a write-up in CT back in July about the PCA, Presbyterian Church in America, voted to leave the NAE after having been in a partnership since the 1970s, and they cited the fact that NAE was advocating on issues like climate change, immigration, the death penalty, and COVID. And I mean, it just seemed like off the bat that was for, I think it was 60% of the delegates who voted to leave the NAE, they just saw that as getting political. So how do you respond, not specifically to the PCA, but people in general who go, hey, we don't want you getting political, and you gave us a theological answer already about, well, we need to form people in all these areas. But what defense do you give pastorally or institutionally for this when that accusation comes up?
Yeah, I think there are a few things that I do in terms of my approach to that. One is to contextualize what is the necessary response in a particular moment. And it varies, right? So institutionally, there are some statements we could make to continue to clarify the theological principles under which these decisions, by which these decisions were made, and to invite dialogue. And that leads me to the third point. So it's one, clarification. of the theological principled reasons why we would do this. Second is to invite dialogue with people with whom we differ. And a lot of times those dialogues will take place outside of the spotlight because it allows it to be more honest. But the third is an attitude that is fundamental, and that is to be quick to listen, slow to speak. I mean, to be very quick to listen to what are the critiques, what can we learn from that. The final thing I would do is oftentimes I think of a lot of this as a bell curve. You know, it swoops up from two wings, and we spend so much time paying attention to the extremes of the bell curves because they are loud. They're the ones that are angry and tweeting and engaging with the issues in public fashions to denounce. But there are literally this bulk of people in the bell curve who just want help, who want help forward, who are maybe convinced in their position, but at least concede that there might be a different way forward or thinking about it. That is the group for whom I am most concerned. That is the group for whom I would wish not only the theology to be presented, but to provide opportunities of formation. And again, those opportunities of formation is what I think this next decade of work, not only at the NAE, but for the church in America, I think that's a huge task for us. Not simply to write white papers or get the gumption to preach, but to understand what would be a holistic approach to the formation of disciples of Jesus in our civic engagements.
So we don't have a ton of time left, but there's a couple other things I want to hit on. One of them was I was going through the website, and NAE's come out with some remarks about the Defense of Marriage Act and just the LGBTQ issue in general. And I actually thought the brief statement that's on the website was incredibly illuminating and helpful. I'm going to read it. It says, as first described in Genesis and later affirmed by Jesus, marriage is a God-ordained covenant relationship between one man and one woman. And then a bunch of scripture references. In a pluralistic society, we seek to embody biblical standards and be a voice of those standards, while we also recognize that people may choose other paths. We oppose unjust discrimination against anyone, including LGBTQ persons. I don't want to get into the LGBTQ thing or the same-sex marriage issue, but what I appreciated about this statement is it takes the Orthodox Christian biblical view, affirms that, but then acknowledges that we exist within a pluralistic society. And there are diverse paths people take, and they deserve dignity and respect. For me, this stood out because it feels like this is the core challenge we're up against. How do we help form evangelicals and evangelical communities to exist in a principled way within a pluralistic society? And it feels like for some folks, they haven't yet come to accept the fact that they are going to exist in a pluralistic society. And there's still this grasping for control and domination and wanting to impose our evangelical values upon everyone else. What other intersections beyond sexuality do you see this issue of accepting the plurality of our society really being challenging for evangelicals, and where can the NAE probably help the most in getting us to accept that reality without giving up our principles?
If we did a better job understanding the baked-in plurality, even within evangelicalism itself, and did a bit better job hearing from various voices, colors, communities of color within evangelicalism, then we begin to understand the implications of the gospel are much broader, and our need to learn from different communities are much more important. I'll give you a very specific example. I was reading this book on spiritual formation written by an African-American pastor for African-American pastors, how to get soul care and rest. And he was going down this litany of issues that would make a pastor's job exhausting. Doing funerals, preaching every week, the Wednesday night prayer group, counseling, on and on and on, right? And, oh, yeah, that is exhausting. But then he added some things that were noteworthy. The pastor's job includes funerals, preaching, Bible studies, counseling. It includes voter registration, civic engagement in issues about the police. Like, for this African-American pastor, that was just a normal part an expectation of what every pastor would need to do within that community. Now, I'm not saying that every African-American pastor is doing all those things or feels even compelled, but there's a default setting about the application of pastoral ministry that is different than, I would say, many white evangelical churches. I would also say this true of the immigrant church. Having come to faith during a time where I was attending a Korean American church, the social application of the gospel was incredibly important for immigrant communities because our very existence as immigrants required us to help each other in our businesses, to help each other navigate the bureaucracy of healthcare, et cetera, et cetera. So there were profound implications of what faith entailed. If we were to be better hearing the diversity of issues within our community, it would expand the borders of our hearts to engage with compassion and thoughtfulness, creativity on the application of the gospel. I think that begins to expand toward those who are not like us. I am so glad. I'm the son of an immigrant and a refugee who had escaped communist China, literally in a boat crossing a river to get to South Korea. And it was people of faith who welcomed my family and my parents in South Korea and helped them to immigrate to America. And at every juncture of our life, evangelicals and people of faith have met us, and that led to my conversion in high school. It's a sad situation to know that as the son of a refugee and immigrant, that evangelicalism may not be as accommodating now, or at least certain segments of it. We have an incredible history where evangelicals have been at the forefront. Again, checkered history, many mistakes for which we should repent of. But in its best iterations, it has learned to engage in pluralistic settings. I mean, Korea was not a Christian country then. It was, by and large, a Buddhist Confucian country. And yet, evangelicals understood how to live respectfully within that context so that they could serve Jesus powerfully. And that powerful witness is ultimately what led people to Christ, not legislating it, not mandating it, but winning people to Jesus because of the love of our witness. I think we in America need to understand that as we are increasingly on the margins, that is not a position that we should lament, but perhaps celebrate as an opportunity to recover a missionary impulse in this best sense, that we need to win other people to Jesus, not exert from the middle, but lead from the margins.
Amen. I wonder if, going back to the example of your family in South Korea and the Christian community in South Korea at the time, it's one thing for Christians to find themselves on the margins having never been at the center versus what at least a lot of white evangelicalism is experiencing in the United States, which is historically having been at the center and now being pushed to the margin. It's a different direction and requires different accommodations and adjustments. Back to your original point, though, is part of the way we learn to engage in a pluralistic society is for evangelicals themselves to engage with the diversity of their own community. And for that reason, I'm very grateful to have you and the NAE in place, because you're one of those nodes where the different streams of evangelicalism intersects with each other and we can learn from each other. Leading me to my last question before we go, we're entering the new year. What are your top priorities for the NAE in 2023? Where do you think you can move the ball a little bit on these things we've been talking about that you're going to be giving your energy to?
Yeah. There are three things. One is a serious and renewed effort to think about what does it mean to present a holistic gospel, a comprehensive gospel for our common life together in this increasingly pluralistic society at very complex times. What does it mean to provide a holistic, comprehensive gospel in this common life that we share for the next generation? To really think about framing our witness for the next generation, to build out resources, to call denominations and institutions to consider that. The second area, and these are all nested within each other, is racial justice and reconciliation as an expression, not just an application that we can take or leave, but an essential expression of the good news of Jesus Christ. I alluded to earlier, the NAE made some incredibly powerful statements in the 50s. I would say failed to show up in the 60s. And we have a moment now to get this right, to actually lead. Because taking the diversity of evangelicalism, increasing diversity of evangelicalism, taking that seriously, I would say it's not just an issue towards society. It's an issue within our own church community that is increasingly like Pentecost. People from every language as a part of the American evangelical community. And thirdly is this area of a public theology that leads to public discipleship and restores our public witness. These are three broad areas, and each of them will have specific, manifestations organizationally. But I would articulate them as the three major concerns, not just for the next year, but I think of them as the next decade's worth of work.
Yeah, it's hard to disagree with that. And we really want to see that progress. I mean, we've talked enough to know that a lot of the values we champion here at the Holy Post seem to overlap significantly with what you're trying to do and your team at NAE, and we look forward to seeing that happen. Walter, thank you so much for your time and for your leadership in this. I'm very grateful for it.
Skye, thanks for this conversation. Truly, truly enjoyable.
The Holy Post podcast is a production of Holy Post Media. Production assistance by Julie Betcher. Editing by Jason Rugg. Help us create more thoughtful Christian media by supporting us at patreon.com/Holy Post. Also, be sure to leave a review on iTunes so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary, plus ukulele, and occasional butt news. Visit holypost.com for show notes, news stories, Holy Post merchandise, and much more.